The sound wasn't a casual knock, it was a summons. 3 sharp, insistent raps on my front door that landed like gavel strikes in the quiet of my evening. I was in my studio, a glass-walled room at the back of my house that overlooked a meticulously kept Japanese garden. The only noises were the whisper of my stylus across a digital tablet and the low hum of the server in the closet. I'd been working for nearly 10 hours, refining the blueprints for a new city library. The lines on my screen were precise, logical. They created order from empty space. My life, for the most part, had been built on the same principle: quiet, structured, and entirely my own. The raps came again, more forceful this time, bordering on violent. I let out a slow breath and slid my chair back. I knew who it was. Nobody else on earth knocked on my door with that kind of presumptuous authority. I padded through the cool, silent house, my bare feet making no sound on the polished concrete floors. I paused at the door, taking a moment to compose my features, preparing myself not for a battle, but for a performance I had played 1,000 times before. When I opened the door, my father, Arthur Vance, was standing there. He was a man who seemed to take up more oxygen than he was entitled to. His suit was bespoke. His expression was a mask of grim urgency. And clutched in his hand was a familiar, expensive leather portfolio, a container for the kind of chaos I'd spent my life trying to design my way out of. His gaze swept over me, and in it I saw no trace of a father looking at his daughter, only a manager assessing an asset. "Eleanor," he said, his voice the same one he used to steamroll zoning committees and intimidate junior associates. It wasn't a greeting, it was a command. "Arthur," I replied, my tone deliberately neutral. I didn't move aside. Behind him, my sister Sophia was hovering. She was an artist in the medium of feigned fragility, with wide, sorrowful eyes and an uncanny ability to frame her self-inflicted disasters as poetic tragedies. Today, she had outdone herself. She looked like a bruised orchid, one hand clutching my father's arm as if she might simply perish without his support. The cashmere coat she wore was one I recognized. I had paid for it. "We have to talk," my father stated, simply pushing past me into the entryway. He didn't need an invitation. He owned the world, and I was just a resident in it. Sophia slipped in behind him, her eyes fixed on the floor. He strode directly into my minimalist living room and dropped the portfolio onto the glass coffee table. The sound cracked through the stillness like a gunshot. He stood over it like a warlord planning his next siege. "I need the money by morning," he ordered. He flipped open the portfolio. Inside was a maelstrom of official-looking documents, threatening letters and overdue statements. Pure chaos, printed and collated. $950,000, Sophia's debt. He let the number hang in the air, a monument to irresponsibility. There can be no delays. I didn't flinch. I had learned years ago that any emotional reaction was a currency he would immediately spend. I looked past him, my eyes landing on my sister. She finally risked a glance at me, her eyes instantly filling with perfectly calibrated tears. "Please, Eleanor," she whispered. That whisper was the most potent weapon in their arsenal. It was engineered to cast me as the heartless one, the cruel matriarch of logic and finance. It was meant to activate a lifetime of conditioned guilt. For most of my life, it had been devastatingly effective. My father saw me looking at her, and his expression hardened. His jaw clenched. "This is not a request," he snarled. "This is about family." Liam lost his job. They got behind on a few things. It snowballed. He described it like a freak weather event, something utterly outside their control. But even from across the room, I could read the names on the credit card statements. Chanel, the Ritz-Carlton, Michelin-starred restaurants where the tasting menu cost 4 figures. This wasn't a snowball. This was a deliberate, 5-star avalanche. I walked to the table and looked down at the mess. I saw predatory loan agreements. I saw massive losses from an online trading account in Liam's name. I saw a second mortgage on their condominium, a condo for which I'd provided the down payment as a wedding gift, a gift meant to be a foundation, not a slush fund. And there, at the bottom of the largest loan application, was a signature I knew as well as my own, Arthur Vance, co-signer. He had personally guaranteed their recklessness, knowing with absolute certainty that he had no intention of ever paying for it. He was guaranteeing it with my hard work. He was guaranteeing it with my future. He was waiting for me to get angry. He was braced for the usual fight. The fight always followed the same script. I would argue, Sophia would weep, he would lecture me about loyalty, and I, exhausted and beaten down, would write the check to restore the peace. That was our toxic family dance. But I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I felt a profound and unnerving nothingness. It was the strange, hollow peace that settles in when you finally confirm a terrible truth you've always suspected. The system was just functioning exactly as it was designed. I was the contingency plan. I was the structural support. I was the one built strong enough to bear the weight of their profound weakness. I looked up from the documents and met my father's steely gaze. Then I looked at Sophia, who was now shredding a tissue in her hands. She looked so breakable. It was a masterpiece of an illusion she had been perfecting for 3 decades. A tiny, unfamiliar smile touched the corner of my lips. It was just enough to unsettle him. He shifted his weight, his armor of arrogance showing the faintest crack. My silence was a variable he hadn't planned for. He only knew how to counter my resistance. "All right," I said. The word was quiet, simple. It landed in the silent room and seemed to absorb all the tension. Sophia let out a shuddering sigh of relief. My father's shoulders visibly relaxed. A familiar look of smug victory began to settle on his face. He'd won. Of course he had. He always won. "Good," he said, snapping the portfolio shut. "I'll have my assistant send you the wiring instructions first thing. Don't be late." He turned and strode to the door. Sophia followed, pausing for a moment to look back at me. "Thank you, Eleanor," she said, her voice thick with what she surely mistook for gratitude. "You're saving our lives." I just gave a slight nod. I watched them walk down the path to their ostentatious German sedan, my father's arm wrapped protectively around Sophia's shoulders, shielding the delicate one from a world that was only ever hard because they refused to be strong. I closed the door, the deadbolt sliding home with a satisfying thud. The silence of my house rushed back in, but it was different now. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was vacant. I stood there for a long time, just breathing. Then I walked back to the coffee table and looked at the leather portfolio. It looked like a tombstone, a marker for the person I was about to bury. 4 hours later, I was standing under the sterile fluorescent lights of O'Hare International. I had a single carry-on, my laptop bag and my purse. I had no specific destination, only a newfound resolve that was as clear and hard as tempered glass. I wasn't running away from them. I was drafting a new blueprint, and in this version, I was neither the villain nor the savior. I was simply gone. Growing up in the Vance household, I quickly learned that love wasn't a comfort, it was a commodity. It wasn't a warm blanket, it was a prize awarded for playing your assigned role correctly. The rules were unspoken, but rigid. If Sophia was sad, my father fixed it. If I excelled, he called it ostentatious. There were only 2 parts to play in our family drama, the delicate flower and the sturdy oak. The casting was decided early, and it was for life. I remember being 11, and Sophia was 9. She decided she wanted a horse, not lessons, an actual horse. My father, a man who loathed the countryside, spent a month consulting with breeders, arranging for stabling, and finally presenting her with a gentle mare as if it were a state secret. Her delighted squeal was his entire compensation. That very same month, my architectural model of a sustainable community won a national youth competition. I had spent 6 months on it, forfeiting weekends, poring over books on urban planning until my eyes burned. When I came home with the first place medal and a check for $5,000, I set them on the kitchen island for him to see. He glanced at them on his way in from the office. "Another one?" he'd said, loosening his tie. "Don't you think you're being a bit much, Eleanor? It's fine to be driven, but nobody likes a braggart." He never asked a single question about the design. The medal and the check ended up in a box in the back of my closet. The lesson was clear. My achievements weren't a source of family pride. They were an indictment. They made Sophia feel inadequate, and protecting Sophia's delicate feelings was the family's primary directive. When our mother passed away, I was 17. She had been the buffer, the soft diplomacy in our little kingdom. Her death didn't break my father. It calcified him. He didn't grieve. He doubled down. All his energy, all his need for absolute control was channeled into shielding the fragile one. Sophia wept for months, and he held her. He arranged for private tutors so she wouldn't have to face the stress of school. He took her to Paris. Her grief was an event to be managed and catered to. I didn't cry, at least not where anyone could see. I grieved in the dead of night, with my face buried in a pillow. I was the one who managed the endless stream of casseroles from sympathetic neighbors. I was the one who sorted through my mom's affairs and paid the bills. I organized the memorial service. I was strong. Therefore, I was invisible. My grief was an administrative task. My father required me to be the unshakable foundation so he could devote his full attention to propping up the leaning tower. That dynamic never wavered. It simply scaled with age. I became the designated provider, the emergency contact, the silent benefactor. It began with small things. In college, Sophia would call me in a panic because she'd maxed out her credit card and couldn't buy groceries. "Don't tell Dad," she'd beg. "He'll be so crushed." So I'd wire her the money. It became our little ritual, a flat tire, a forgotten bill. A trip to Bali she swore was for a wellness retreat. Each transaction was a secret pact between us, a conspiracy that preserved her flawless image in our father's eyes and cemented my role as the unseen support structure. I put myself through architecture school with a patchwork of scholarships and 3 part-time jobs. I graduated with honors and founded my own architectural firm by the time I was 26. I was good with money because I had to be. I understood its value because I had earned every single cent. But my success was never treated as my own. It was a family utility. When Sophia and her new husband, Liam, wanted to buy a condo, their credit was a disaster. I didn't just give them the down payment, I bought the property under one of my holding companies and created a rent-to-own agreement for them with terms so ridiculously favorable they were essentially living for free. It was a clean business transaction, I told myself, but it wasn't. It was just another shackle in a long chain. My father lauded me for my generosity. "That's what family is for," he'd declared, clapping me on the back. "The strong are meant to look after the weak." He said it like a compliment. It felt like a life sentence. Then came the wedding. Sophia dreamed of a society fairy tale. My father was determined to give it to her. But his own finances were a precarious house of cards built on high-risk ventures and extravagant living. So the burden, as always, fell to me. The historic venue, the designer gown, the champagne tower. I paid for all of it, discreetly, through my firm. To the outside world, it appeared as if my father was the magnanimous patriarch, hosting a lavish affair for his cherished daughter. Only a handful of us knew the truth. Every invoice I paid felt like I was erasing another piece of myself. I was no longer Eleanor Vance, the award-winning architect. I was a function, an ATM, a walking, talking line of credit with a familial obligation clause. My father's favorite toast was family first. He'd say it at every holiday, every celebration, but he never meant the family as a unit. He meant the family hierarchy. He meant that my work, my money, and my future always came second to Sophia's latest whim. I was first in the line of sacrifice, but last in the line of consideration. I wasn't his daughter. I was his portfolio. And tonight, when he stood in my living room and demanded nearly $1 million, he wasn't asking for help. He was liquidating an asset. The cost of being the strong one had finally exceeded its value. After they were gone, I stood motionless in the center of my living room, listening to the hum of the house. It felt cavernous and cold. On the coffee table, the leather portfolio sat like a black hole, sucking all the light and warmth out of the room. I felt a morbid pull towards it, the same instinct that makes you slow down to look at a car wreck. I had to see the full extent of the damage. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea, my hands moving with robotic precision. I carried the warm mug back to the sofa and sat, placing it on a coaster with careful deliberation. I stared at the portfolio for another minute before finally reaching out and opening it. The first page was a summary, a crisply typed letter from a law firm known for its aggressive, no-nonsense approach to debt collection. The letter was addressed to Arthur Vance and to Mr. and Mrs. Liam Croft. It was a final notice before legal proceedings commenced. The total at the bottom was $967,322.14. My father had rounded down by more than $60,000, as if that would make the demand seem more palatable. I began to sift through the documents, one by one. It was a detailed atlas of their recklessness. There were statements from 7 different high-limit credit cards, all pushed to their maximum. I scanned the itemized lists. It was a litany of brand names: Balenciaga, Cartier, Hermes. There were charges from exclusive spas in Sedona, suites at the Bellagio in Las Vegas, and a single purchase from a jeweler in Aspen for over $40,000. It was a highlight reel of a life I wasn't just bankrolling, but one I myself would never dream of living. I was too busy working. Then I found the brokerage statements. They were from a high-risk offshore trading platform under Liam's name. The losses were breathtaking. Tens of thousands of dollars wiped out in a single afternoon, day after day. He'd been chasing his losses, digging the hole deeper with every frantic, desperate trade. And Sophia had been right there beside him, soothing their rising panic with $5,000 handbags. But the real gut punch was the loan agreements. They had taken out a second mortgage on the condo I bought. They had borrowed against my generosity. They had taken the foundation I gave them and turned it into collateral for their chaos. The interest rate was extortionate. They must have been truly desperate. And there, at the bottom of the agreement, beside Sophia's and Liam's frantic signatures, was my father's, Arthur Vance, guarantor. He had put his name on the line, pledging to cover their debt if they defaulted. But I knew exactly what that signature meant. He wasn't pledging his own assets. He was pledging mine. He had strode into that lender's office, looked that man in the eye, and signed a contract he fully expected me to honor. He had used his name and his reputation to leverage my money. It was the ultimate act of betrayal. This wasn't just about enabling his favorite child. This was a cold, calculated business move. He had assessed the risk, reviewed his own portfolio, reviewed my portfolio, and decided it was a sound investment. Because he had me. I was his ultimate insurance policy. A deep, glacial cold spread through my chest. The story had said I wasn't angry, and it was true. Anger is a hot, passionate emotion. This was something else entirely. It was the cold, diamond-hard clarity of a final diagnosis. For years, I'd told myself a comforting story that my father loved me, but was just worried about Sophia. That he relied on my strength because he was proud of it. That our family, while dysfunctional, was ultimately bound by a complicated love. That story was a lie. This folder was the truth. The truth was, to him, I was not a daughter. I was a utility. My success wasn't a source of pride. It was a resource to be plundered. He didn't love me for my strength. He valued me for my function. He had raised one daughter to be a pampered princess and the other to be the workhorse that paid for the upkeep of the castle. He expected me to fold, the way I always had. He expected an argument, some tears, and then, ultimately, capitulation. He expected a wire transfer in the morning and a tense family dinner the following Sunday, where we would all pretend this ugliness never happened. He expected me to absorb this crisis, just as I had absorbed all the others. He would tell me it was for family. He would use the word love as a bludgeon. He would try to wrap this raw transaction in decades of manufactured guilt. But as I looked at the cold, hard numbers, I felt nothing. The guilt had evaporated. The obligation had vanished. All those years I'd spent trying to win his approval, hoping he would one day truly see me, suddenly felt so foolish. He had always seen me. He had seen me for exactly what I was to him, a solution. I closed the portfolio. The performance was over. I didn't have to play my part anymore. I wasn't angry. I was finished. By midnight, the decision had set. It wasn't a frantic, emotional reaction. It was a calm, rational conclusion, an architectural decision. The family structure was fundamentally unsound, and it was time for a controlled demolition. I went into my studio, the same room where I had built my success, and sat at my desk. The library blueprints were still on the screen, a project founded on logic, integrity, and clear boundaries. My life now required the same. My first call was to Jessica Riley. Jess was more than my attorney. She was my oldest friend. We'd met in our first year of architecture school, two scholarship kids trying to make sense of a world we weren't born into. She had witnessed my family's toxic dynamic firsthand for years. She was the one I called after every holiday dinner, every birthday crisis, every new financial emergency. She had listened patiently for over a decade, her advice always the same. You can't set yourself on fire to keep them warm, Eleanor. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep. This had better be an emergency. It's me, I said. I heard a rustle, the sound of her sitting up in bed. What did he do this time? She asked, instantly alert. He came to the house. With Sophia. They need $950,000. By morning. I heard her let out a long, slow sigh. It was a sound of profound, weary resignation. So, just another Tuesday, she said, her voice laced with sarcasm. Then her tone sharpened, becoming focused. What did you tell him? I told him all right. There was a beat of silence on the line. Then her voice came back, softer, filled with a cautious hope. Please tell me you're finally doing it, Elle. Please tell me you're done. I'm done funding the chaos, I replied, my voice unwavering. I need your help. I want to sever everything, completely, legally, and quietly. I've had the necessary documents drafted for 5 years, she said without a moment's hesitation. Give me 30 minutes. I'll send you everything for a digital signature. We'll start by revoking his power of attorney over that joint investment fund. I had almost forgotten about that, an account I'd set up for my father's retirement, with him as a beneficiary and limited POA for medical emergencies. He had clearly seen it as just another annex of my empire. Let's do it, I said. All of it. Within the hour, my inbox was populated with legal documents. With Jess on the phone, walking me through the clauses, I began to systematically dismantle the financial prison I had built for myself. Every click of the mouse was a snip of a wire binding me to them. First, the properties. The holding company that owned the title to Sophia's condo was immediately dissolved and the asset transferred to a new, anonymous LLC that my father had no knowledge of. The trust I had established for his own later years was frozen. He wouldn't be able to access a single penny without my explicit, notarized consent. Next, the accounts. His shared access to my primary investment portfolio was revoked. His name was scrubbed from every asset. I transferred the bulk of my liquid capital into a new private bank, one he couldn't possibly trace. The process was silent, digital, and absolute. I was using the very skills he had once dismissed as bragging to construct a firewall he could never breach. My competence had become my fortress. Once the financial separation was complete, I began packing the box. I found a sturdy shipping box in a storage closet. I went through my home office files, pulling copies of every major transaction: a copy of the check for Sophia's private university tuition, the property transfer documents for their condo, invoices from the wedding planner, the caterer, the florist, all marked paid in full by my firm. I printed bank statements showing the dozens of smaller wire transfers over the years, the ones for car trouble and a little credit card help. I took screenshots of every pleading text from Sophia, every demanding email from my father. Each sheet of paper was a receipt for a piece of my life I had given away. Piling them in the box felt like an audit of my soul. It was a physical record of my silent sacrifices. Then, I found the document I was looking for, a copy of a withdrawal authorization form from 3 years ago, which my father had used to pull funds from our joint account to cover one of his own failed investments. He had offered to sign for me since I was out of the country on business. I looked at the signature, a passable imitation of my own, good enough to fool a busy bank teller. At the time, I'd let it slide. It was easier than confronting him. Now, it was Exhibit A. I placed everything in the box. On top of the mountain of paper, I put a small USB drive. It contained digital copies of every document, plus a recording of a voicemail he'd left me last year, instructing me to be a good daughter and clean up Sophia's latest mess. Finally, I took a sheet of my personal stationery and wrote a short, simple note in clear, steady script. You always said family comes first. Perhaps honesty should come before that. I folded the note and placed it on top of the USB drive. I sealed the box with packing tape. It was heavy. It felt as heavy as my entire adult life. I carried it to the front door and set it on the porch, right where they would be sure to see it when they returned in the morning, expecting a check. My plan was quiet, legal, and absolute. There would be no screaming match, no dramatic confrontation. My exit from their lives would be as silent and efficient as one of my own architectural projects. I didn't sleep. After the box was packed and the accounts were firewalled, I walked through my house. It was a beautiful house, a testament to my work, filled with objects I had chosen and earned. It had been my sanctuary, but tonight it felt like a cage, however gilded. I touched the cool quartz of the kitchen island, ran my hand along the supple leather of the sofa. These were the spoils of being the strong one, and I was ready to leave them all behind. I packed one suitcase with practical things: jeans, sweaters, hiking boots, my laptop. I left the designer clothes hanging in the closet. The expensive jewelry sat untouched in its box. I was shedding a skin, and I intended to travel light. The person I was becoming had no need for such things. At 4:30 a.m., I called a car. The city was dark and still as we drove toward the airport. The familiar Chicago skyline, a view that usually filled me with a sense of pride, looked alien. The towering skyscrapers felt like monuments to a life that was no longer mine. I watched them recede in the rearview mirror until they were just a faint glimmer against the pre-dawn sky. I felt no sadness, no nostalgia, just a quiet, determined sense of forward momentum. The airport at that hour was a cavern of hushed activity. I felt wonderfully anonymous, a ghost in the machine. I wasn't a sister or a daughter here. I wasn't the solution to anyone's self-made problem. I was just a woman with a suitcase. I walked up to the massive departures board, a glittering tapestry of 100 different futures. My eyes scanned the list of cities: Rome, Tokyo, Buenos Aires. I was tempted for a moment, but I wasn't looking for an escape into noise and distraction. I was looking for quiet. I was looking for a place where the landscape was louder than the people. My eyes stopped on a name: Portland, Oregon. From there, I knew I could rent a car and drive to the coast. I imagined the images I'd seen online, jagged rock formations rising from the mist, relentless waves crashing on wide-open beaches, ancient forests that smelled of rain and earth. It felt right. "A one-way ticket to Portland, Oregon, please," I said to the agent at the counter. She smiled, her fingers tapping away. "One way?" She confirmed. "Yes," I said, the words feeling solid and real. "One way." I found my gate and sat, watching the sky outside the terminal window slowly bleed from black to a soft pearlescent gray. I bought a coffee and drank it slowly, feeling the warmth seep into me. I didn't check my phone. I didn't need to. I knew what was happening back in the city. My father was waking up confident. Sophia was sleeping late, relieved. They were living in their final hours of blissful, arrogant ignorance. They believed I was at home, preparing to transfer the money, preparing to fall back into my designated place. When they called my flight, I stood up and walked down the jet bridge without a single backward glance. I found my window seat and buckled myself in. The mundane sounds of the pre-flight safety announcements were deeply comforting. They were the sounds of a system that worked, of a journey with a clear beginning. The plane taxied onto the runway and paused. For a single suspended moment, everything was still. I looked out the window at the sprawling city, now beginning to stir below. A city full of my history, a city full of their expectations. Then the engines roared to life. The plane surged forward, pressing me back into my seat. The acceleration was thrilling, and then came that magical moment of liftoff. That impossible feeling of leaving the ground behind. The earth fell away, and the city shrank into a neat, orderly grid. The buildings that had seemed so monolithic were now just tiny blocks. The expressways were just thin gray ribbons. Everything that had felt so heavy, so suffocating, was suddenly small and distant. As the plane broke through the cloud cover and into the brilliant, clean sunlight, I finally let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for my entire life. It was a release of pressure, of obligation, of a weight I had forgotten I was even carrying. For years, I had been their safety net, always there to catch them. Now, I was the consequence, the empty space where the net used to be. And for the first time, I felt truly, completely, and utterly free. I was over 2,000 miles away, sitting on the small, weathered deck of a rented cottage on the Oregon coast. The air tasted of salt and smelled of pine. In my hand, I held a warm mug of coffee. On the small table beside me, my phone was propped up, displaying a live feed from the smart doorbell at my house in Chicago. It was exactly 12 o'clock Central Time. I knew he would be punctual. Punctuality for him was a form of control, and my father was a man obsessed with control. Right on schedule, his black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. The car itself was an act of aggression, a sleek, powerful machine that cost more than most people's houses. He got out, smoothing his suit jacket, his movements rigid with contained fury. Sophia slid out of the passenger seat. Even on the pixelated video feed, she looked like a wreck. Her hair was a mess, and her face was puffy and swollen from crying. Her practiced fragility had been replaced by genuine, unglamorous exhaustion. My father marched up the stone walkway, with Sophia stumbling a few steps behind him. He didn't knock. He hammered on the door with the side of his fist, the thuds echoing faintly through my phone's speaker. "Eleanor, open this door! We had an agreement!" he yelled. His voice carried its usual tone of command, but I could hear a slight tremor underneath it, a flicker of panic. The wire transfer had not arrived. His perfect solution had failed to materialize. He hammered on the door again, harder this time. "Eleanor, I'm not playing games. You said all right." Sophia wrung her hands, glancing around nervously as if the neighbors might be peeking through their curtains. "Dad, maybe she's not here," she said, her voice thin and high. "She's here," he growled. "She's just trying to be dramatic." It was then that his eyes fell on it. The plain brown shipping box sitting just to the side of the welcome mat. He froze, his fist still raised. He stared at it for a long, silent moment. Sophia peered around him, her expression a mixture of confusion and fear. "What is that?" she asked. My father didn't reply. He bent down cautiously, as if the box might be booby-trapped, and lifted it. He gave it a gentle shake, then set it on the porch railing and tore at the packing tape with rough, impatient fingers. He pulled back the cardboard flaps and looked inside. From my vantage point, 2,000 miles away, I couldn't see his face, only the rigid set of his shoulders and the back of his head. He reached in and pulled out the first sheaf of papers. They were the itemized credit card receipts from Sophia's shopping sprees. He flipped through them, his movement slowing. He pulled out the next stack, the invoices from the wedding. Then the deed to their condo with my LLC's name printed in stark, undeniable letters. I watched him stand there, motionless, for what felt like an eternity. He was processing. For the first time, he was seeing the full documented cost of his family's entitlement. He was seeing 30 years of my silent compliance, quantified and itemized in black and white. Sophia crept closer. "Dad, what is it?" He ignored her. He reached back into the box and his hand emerged with the copy of the withdrawal authorization, the one bearing his forged signature. He held it up, the single sheet of paper trembling almost imperceptibly in his hand. That was the one. The receipt for his ultimate betrayal. The proof that his entitlement had crossed the line from familial pressure into outright fraud. Finally, his hand found the small USB drive. He looked at it, puzzled. Then he noticed the small, portable Bluetooth speaker I had left on the porch table, fully charged. He was a man who understood technology. He knew what to do. With a few fumbling motions, he paired the devices. A moment of static, and then my voice filled the quiet suburban afternoon. It was calm, measured, and devoid of all emotion. It was the voice I used for client presentations. "Arthur," my voice said from the speaker, "for years, you told me my greatest assets were my intellect and my work ethic. You were right. You taught me how to build a portfolio, how to leverage assets, and how to cut my losses on a bad investment. This isn't an act of anger. It's an audit, a final accounting for a debt that was never mine to carry." The recording ended. The only sound was a bird chirping somewhere down the street. He didn't move. It wasn't a dramatic collapse. It was a quiet, internal implosion. His shoulders, which had always been so squared with arrogance, seemed to slump. The power drained from his posture, leaving behind the tired, stooped frame of an old man. The grand illusion of his control, the very foundation of his identity, had just been shattered. He looked down at the papers in his hand, not as a king surveying his domain, but as a man reading his own financial obituary. Sophia just stared at the speaker, her mouth hanging open. The smudged mascara on her cheeks looked like war paint on her pale skin. She wasn't just a beneficiary of the system anymore. She was an accomplice. Slowly, methodically, he placed every single piece of paper back into the box. He closed the flaps. He didn't look at my door again. He turned, walked back to his car, and drove away, leaving Sophia standing alone on the porch amidst the wreckage of their shared fantasy. In Oregon, the days settled into a new rhythm, one dictated by the tides, not by deadlines. I woke with the sun, drank my coffee on the deck watching the fishing boats head out into the morning mist, and took long, meditative walks along the dramatic coastline. The chaos of my old life was 2,000 miles and a universe away. The quiet was profound. It was the kind of quiet that allows you to finally hear your own thoughts. The fallout, when it came, was relayed to me in calm, clinical updates from Jess. "Your father's firm just had its primary credit line frozen," she told me over the phone one afternoon. "When you moved your assets, it triggered a dozen liquidity covenants with his bank. They got spooked. It seems his empire was more leveraged against your personal wealth than even we suspected." I imagined my father sitting in a sterile boardroom, his usual bluster gone, trying to explain to a panel of grim-faced accountants why the bedrock of his financial world had simply vanished overnight. He had built a skyscraper on my foundation, and I had just quietly excavated it. Then came the social media implosion. Sophia's online persona was a meticulously curated fantasy of gallery openings, charity galas, and five-star travel. Her entire identity was a brand built on a lifestyle she had not earned. But the internet has a cruel memory. Someone must have talked. A whisper from a disgruntled former employee at my father's firm, perhaps, or a so-called friend she had bragged to. The comments on her popular Instagram feed began to turn. "I thought you were rich. Isn't that the bag her sister paid for?" Heard the family ATM got shut down. Enjoying that $1,000 brunch? Hope it was worth $950,000. The posts stopped. Her vibrant, colorful page went dark. The digital facade had crumbled, revealing the ugly, desperate reality underneath. Jess told me that Liam was gone. He had sent Sophia a brief text saying he was going on a business trip and needed some space. He had been a willing co-pilot for her fantasy, but he had no intention of being a passenger in her freefall. Creditors began calling my father's office, then his home. The polite inquiries turned into relentless, aggressive demands. They were no longer dealing with a titan of industry who could make problems vanish with a single phone call. They were dealing with a debtor. His once intimidating silence was now just the heavy, oppressive silence of shame. I felt a strange clinical detachment from all of it. It was like reading a business case study about a failed company. There was no joy, no triumphant sense of revenge. There was only a quiet, sad feeling of inevitability. This was always going to happen. I hadn't caused their collapse. I had simply stopped preventing it. I had let gravity take its course. One evening, I sat on a large, sea-smoothed boulder, watching the Pacific. The waves crashed against the shore in a powerful, steady rhythm, relentless, unfeeling, and utterly predictable. For years, I had been the opposite. I had been the seawall holding back the tide of their consequences. I had absorbed their chaos. I had buffered them from the results of their own choices. Now I was sitting on a rock in Oregon, listening to the ocean instead of their drama. The price of their stability had always been my peace, and I had finally decided to pay myself back. About a week after the incident with the box, Jess called with another update. Her voice was even, as always. "He's liquidating, Eleanor," she said. "He's put the house on the market. Not Sophia's condo, his, the big family home in Winnetka." I listened, picturing the house I grew up in, the manicured lawn, the cavernous rooms filled with expensive things meant to impress. It was a stage, and my father had always been the lead actor. Now he was selling the theater. "He has to," I said, my voice quiet. It wasn't a statement of malice, but of fact. "You can't rebuild until you find the bedrock." "I agree," Jess said. "Just wanted you to know." The firewall is holding perfectly. A few of their more desperate creditors tried to pierce the corporate veil on your LLC, but the paperwork is ironclad. You're untouchable. Untouchable. The word hung in the air after we hung up. For so long, I had been the most touchable person in their lives. Always on call, always accessible, always there to absorb the impact. Being untouchable felt like a superpower. Then, a week later, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number with a Chicago area code. My first instinct was to let it go to voicemail. I had become fiercely protective of my newfound peace. But something made me answer. I pressed the phone to my ear, saying nothing. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of shaky breathing on the other end. Then a voice. "Eleanor." It was my father. But it wasn't his voice. The booming authority was gone. The arrogance was gone. It was quiet, stripped bare. It was the voice of a man who had lost everything, especially his own illusions. I waited. "We need to talk," he said. It wasn't a demand this time. It sounded like a plea. "There's nothing left to talk about, Arthur," I said. My voice was even, not cold, just factual. There was a long pause. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background on his end. He was probably sitting in his half-empty mansion, the movers having already carted off the expensive props. "You humiliated me," he said, a flicker of the old Arthur surfacing. "You aired our private business for the world to see." "You created the business," I replied calmly. "I just stopped being your silent partner." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't angry, it was defeated. I heard him take a ragged breath. "You were right," he finally whispered, the words sounding like they were being physically torn from him, heavy and painful. "In the box, the note. All of it. I wasn't saving the family, I was managing it. And you were my best performing asset." It was the most honest, brutal thing he had ever said to me. And in its own twisted way, it was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging my true value to him. Something hard inside me, a knot of resentment I had carried for decades, finally loosened. It wasn't forgiveness, it was just a release. "You taught me business, Dad," I said quietly, the ocean roaring softly in the background. "You taught me how to read a balance sheet and how to spot a bad investment. You just never taught me what it meant to be a daughter." His voice, when he finally spoke again, was thick with something I couldn't quite identify. Regret, maybe, or just the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had finally run out of lies. "I'm learning now," he whispered. Then he hung up. I stood there on my deck, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel victorious. I just felt a profound, aching sadness for the man who had to lose a fortune to learn the value of his own child. 3 months later, Oregon had become home. The rented cottage was now mine, bought with cash. The ocean was loud, but the quiet inside me was louder. I had found a new rhythm, one that belonged only to me. I started hosting free financial literacy workshops for women at the local community center. The room was always packed. It was filled with daughters and sisters and wives who, in their own ways, had been trained to be the designated fixers. They were women who had been taught that wanting financial security for themselves was selfish. They had co-signed loans for deadbeat boyfriends, emptied their savings for troubled siblings, and put their family's needs so far ahead of their own that they'd forgotten they were even allowed to have any. I taught them about budgeting, about investing, about setting up LLCs to protect their assets. But mostly, I taught them about the architecture of boundaries. "Your money is a tool," I'd tell them, looking out at their earnest, tired faces. "It's a tool to build a life for yourself. It is not an obligation you owe to anyone who happens to share your blood." When I told them that sometimes walking away is the most generous thing you can do, for yourself and for them, they would nod. They would nod because they knew. They understood the deep exhaustion of being the strong one. They knew the crushing weight of being the endless safety net. In that small, dusty room, we were a quiet army of survivors, and I was healing myself by teaching them how to build their own fortresses. One afternoon, my phone rang. It was an unknown number, but not the same one as before. I answered. "Eleanor?" The voice was hesitant, fragile. It was Sophia. "Hi, Sophia," I said, my tone neutral. "Hi," she said. I know you probably don't want to hear from me." "I'm listening," I said. I could hear her take a deep, steadying breath. "I got a job," she said. "I'm a receptionist at a dental office. It doesn't pay much, but it's mine." The humility in her voice was startling. The Sophia I knew would never have been able to admit to holding such a normal, unglamorous job. "Liam left," she added, almost as an afterthought. "He cleaned out what was left of our joint account. I guess I deserved that." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "Don't be," she said quickly. "It's okay. It's hard, but it's real. I wanted to say thank you." I was confused. "For what?" Her voice cracked. just a little. "For not saving me," she said. "For not giving Dad the money. If you had, I'd still be with Liam. We'd still be lying and spending, and it just would have gotten worse. This is the first time in my life I've had to actually be a grown-up, and it's terrifying. But it's mine." She paused. "Thank you for letting me fail." I closed my eyes. All those years, I thought saving her was my job. I thought that's what love was. And here she was, thanking me for finally letting her fall. For the first time, her words didn't sound like a manipulation. They sounded like freedom. Weeks later, a postcard appeared in my mailbox. The picture on the front was a faded photograph of a fishing pier somewhere in Florida. It was the kind of cheap, flimsy card you buy at a gas station. I turned it over. The handwriting was my father's, but it was shaky and uneven. It looked like an old man's writing. The message was just a few words. "You were right. I taught you profit, not peace. Learning now, proud of you, Dad. Proud of you." 3 words I had spent my entire life trying to earn. 3 words that had always been reserved for Sophia's imagined triumphs. And now, here they were, scrawled on the back of a cheap postcard. They had arrived long after I had stopped needing to hear them, which I realized was the only reason I could finally believe them. I took the postcard inside and pinned it to the corkboard above my desk. It wasn't a trophy. It wasn't a prize. It was just a quiet postscript at the end of a very long, very complicated story. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I pulled on a sweater and walked down to the beach. The moon was a perfect luminous circle, casting a silver road across the dark water. The air was cool and sharp, and the only sound was the constant rhythmic crash and retreat of the waves. I walked along the shoreline for a long time, the cool wind on my face. I thought about the box, the phone calls, the postcard. I thought about the woman who had packed a suitcase in the dead of night and the woman who was standing here now. They were the same person, but they were also worlds apart. For so many years, my life had been defined by them, their drama, their needs, their chaos. I had defined myself by my role in their story, the savior, the provider, the strong one. Now, standing here with nothing but the sound of the sea for company, I felt the vast open space where all that obligation used to be, and it wasn't empty at all. It was filled with peace. The waves whispered against the rocks, a sound that knew nothing of debt or family or guilt. I took a deep breath of the salty air. There were no tears. There was no lingering anger. There was only the powerful, steady rhythm of the sea and the quiet, unshakable freedom that doesn't need anyone's permission to exist. End of story.